Now, this is the first A-level revision style lesson. Also, a lesson, this is both for current Year 12 and Year 11 going into Year 12 to get your head around what we look at in paper 1 of A-level. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go through today Unit 1. I'm going to go through the first part and we're going to do small revision videos just to get our head around it. Now, I've put tasks in throughout this video. This can be done by current Year 12 for a form of revision, or this is what I expect Year 11 into 12 to do as their transition work, as well as the little booklet that I've given you. So then twice a week, you'll get different lessons on this. So the first unit we look at in Year 12 is how parliamentary democracy grew in Britain 1785 to 1870. So basically what that means is, how did people's voting rights change in the year 1785 to 1870? How did democracy grow? How did it go from basically nobody voting to a more developed form of voting by 1867? Okay, and what we're going to look at with this lesson in particular is we're going to look at the unreformed parliament, we're going to look at the pre-reform electorate, parliamentary seats and elections. That might seem confusing. It will make more sense as I go through the lesson. This is everything that's included in Unit 1. There's 5 units for my paper, and that will be taught over an 8-month period. Now, before we delve into anything to do with this course, we've got to understand how the political system works in the 1700s. Now, we know that today, if you're over the age of 18, you can vote for an MP, local and national. That's a typo there. It was very different in the 18th century. So, the concept of democracy actually came from Greece, but it didn't come to Britain until reforms were put in place. So now, the reason for these changes was to keep the country stable and keep important people on the government side. From the 1700s through to the late 1800s, Britain went through an industrial revolution. Now, you probably wouldn't have done this since year 8. You would have done a bit of it in medicine. But the Industrial Revolution was when Britain grew commercially. There was more factories, more money, the economy was booming. But this meant that the political system in Britain that was in place since the Middle Ages was becoming very outdated. It was an old system in an expanding country. So this was a big problem for the government. And, you know, if we're going to put it into perspective, the government in the time period of this course were made up by rich men. There was no vote for women, there was no vote for working class people, and there was very little vote for the middle class until 1832. So it was, if you were a rich, wealthy landowner, you would have the power politically as well as socially, economically. You would hold most of the power in the country. But things started to change in 1793 when the French Revolution occurred, and it meant that a lot of politicians in Britain became scared of revolution. Now, if you're not sure what the French Revolution was, it was when people turned on the rich aristocracy royal family in France and had them killed. The British government was scared that the people of Britain were going to do the same thing to them. So the British government were in a bit of a situation, and we'll talk about that later on. Now, Britain didn't have an organised model of politics. Nothing was written down. That's important. If nothing's written down, then things are easy to change, which meant the government was more flexible, which allowed solutions to be found, but it also allowed corruption to occur. Corruption, if you were an MP that was corrupt and you tried to buy something or cheat the system, you wouldn't get punished. Britain was very slow to evolve politically, and it meant that the monarch was also alongside the government. So it's really important to understand that it wasn't like today's society where the Queen just stays out the way and just does a speech a couple of times a year. In this period, the king also wanted to have a form of power alongside a government who were passing laws. That causes problems. Now, the way in which Parliament works, some of you might not know, so it's important that we address it before we go into this course, is that Parliament is separated into 2 houses. The House of Commons represents the ordinary people, and the House of Lords reflected the country's rich people. Now, the monarchy and the House of Lords had a lot of power during this course, unlike today, where the House of Commons is very important. So the House of Commons decide on the laws, and if they pass a law in the House of Commons, it has to be okayed by the House of Lords. In this period, because the House of Lords were all very rich, the only laws that were really passed were the ones that benefited rich people. So if you were a working class man or a middle class man starting up in society, the chance of you having a say was very little. The king would still make major policy decisions. He was able to select ministers, and the Lords were able to block laws which were proposed by the Commons. So there was a balance. So it means that the Commons weren't dominating, but it also means that the rich people dominated society, which meant society would be it would be focused on one aspect. Now, the Parliament in 1785 was not representative equally. So it was made up of rich individuals who had influence. To sit in the House of Lords, you required a peerage, and the Commons were chosen through an election. So if you were voted into the House of Commons, you had to be voted in through an election. To get into the House of Lords, you required a peerage. Okay? Now, before I go on to that, you must understand that you couldn't stand in an election unless you had wealth. The main reason why is because if you were an MP in 1785, you wouldn't get paid, unlike today, where MPs are paid for basically everything. Okay? It would be really impossible for an ordinary person to stand unless they had patronage. However, patronage, which means someone who funded someone, was only given to men with influence. So this was shown in 1761 when 111 of the elected men of the House of Commons were financed by 55 people in the House of Lords. Half of the Commons by 1801 were sponsored by members of the House of Lords. So over 300 of the MPs actually got into power because the House of Lords peers had paid for their route to power. So basically, how does the political system work? It's unequal. If you're rich, you're loving life. It's a very disjointed, unrepresentative system. It had a lot of change. It had to move with the times. Did it? Spoiler alert here, no it didn't. So the first task, what do the following words have to do with politics Britain in the 1700s? Just write these words down. Write that as a subtitle. Political system in Britain, how did it work? French Revolution, corruption, House of Commons, House of Lords, peerage, king, unequal. And just write a couple of sentences about how they link to politics in Britain in the 1700s. If you pause the video here, you can do this task and then move on to the next one. So, a little bit of repetition here. How did the people vote in England in 1785 and what were the problems? How do we vote today? So we're all in something called a constituency. So we're all put in certain areas where we vote for our local MP, our national MP, and they will represent us. A local MP will represent us at a local level. A national MP will go to the House of Commons and debate and vote for the people of the constituency. We have local elections, we have national elections. But what needs to be understood is the voting system that we have today was ridiculously different to what it was in 1785. What needs to be understood is that men were the only people that could vote in 1785, and men who were rich and had land over a certain amount. Now, the voting franchise, so the voting system was actually created in Middle Ages and based on tradition rather than structure. So there was no structure to the political system. It was based on who you were, what you knew, how much money you had. So you could say that by 1785, the voting system was a little bit outdated. And just to make it a little bit more confusing, the vote that you had depended on which constituency you lived in. There were two types of constituency. Okay, this is non-existent in today's society, but you either lived in the counties or the boroughs. And depending on where you lived, depended on how you could vote. This is some information on counties and boroughs. Now, this is going to be totally new to some of you, which is okay. But what you need to understand is, and we'll go back to it, today's society, you can vote if you're over 18, man or woman. The voting qualifications are, very, very broad in our country. They were a lot more limited in England in 1785. So if you were a county was a rural shire, so think farmland in Britain. They could elect 2 MPs to Westminster. So in the House of Commons, every county could elect 2 MPs. Now, the way in which people in counties could vote was set up in an Act of Parliament in 1430. So that this whole system was set up, a long, long time ago, which means the whole system is very outdated. And in 1430, you were allowed to vote if you were in a county, if you had a property that was worth 40 shillings, which is about £2, you could vote. If you're in Scotland, that was set at £100, so it was very different. But because of inflation, the value of money did go down, which meant that this was a very wide franchise, and that you had a range of people that could vote. The only problem was, it didn't matter how big your county was. You still only got 2 MPs. Okay, so tiny places got the same number of people representing them as the biggest places. Now, by representing, let's just go back. Say, for example, ask Broxtowe. You got the Broxtowe Council. We vote an MP to represent the Broxtowe Council. Now, we obviously get 1 national MP per constituency in this country. But in each county, you'd have 2 MPs that would go to the House of Commons representing you. But this was a problem because you had places in 1800 like Bedfordshire that had 2,000 people. But Yorkshire had 20,000. But you only got 2 MPs in both places. It didn't work. Okay, if you were Bedfordshire, 2,002 people, okay, you can represent them. But if you are the 2 MPs that represent Yorkshire, you've got 20,000 people to represent. Can you see them all? Probably not. Can you really represent that many people? Again, probably not. Counties, though, there was really one set way that you could vote that depended on how much your property was worth. Then you've got the boroughs. Now, the boroughs were more exclusive than the county. So boroughs were the urban towns which had been given rights in the Middle Ages. So those of you that remember the Richard and John course, remember towns could be given royal rights. They were known as boroughs. Like the counties, they had two MPs. But the difference is, in a borough, there were more ways that you could vote. And these, I'm going to go through some of them. So first of all, corporation. If you were part of the town council and you were a male, you could vote. If you're a freeman, if you had the status of a freeman, you could vote. Now, you would get this title from your father or through marriage. And you could also get it if you were given an award, I'm not unaware, from the corporation. So if you were given an award by the town council, you would get status of a freeman. Or if you were an apprentice in the borough, you would be given the vote. Again, if you were a male, an apprentice would obviously be quite well off as time goes on. Scot and lot, anyone who paid poor rate. Now, poor rate was a special tax that the rich would pay to help the poor people in society. So if you paid the Scot and lot, you would be able to vote. Likewise, another qualification was through the burgage. And a burgage was an old rent that was paid that applied to a property in a borough. Anyone who owned a burgage could vote. That one's more confusing, okay? But it's basically this concept of it was a rent that was paid that applied to property. So if you had an old property in a borough and you paid rent on it, known as a burgage, you could vote. Potwalloper. Someone who had a hearth big enough to boil a pot could vote. But if you had a big fireplace and you could boil a hearth, you had a hearth big enough, to boil a pot, you could vote. And then you had a freeholder. So this was similar to the counties, having a property worth a certain amount. The difference between these two is that the boroughs were very much more, there was more of a range. Counties, it depended on your freehold status. But the one thing that's very clear is that the way in which you can vote was determined by one thing, the money that you had. This is the task that I'd like you to do. Write down a list of problems with the voting system of the counties and the boroughs. So you could create, the subtitle will be Problems with the Voting System of Counties and Boroughs. In one colour, write about the counties, in one colour, write about the boroughs. And then a little bit of a keyword task. What do the following words mean? Franchise, counties, freehold property, inflation, borough, cooperation, Scott and Lot, and a pot walloper. At A level, the writing style, it will develop. We will work on that. But one thing that needs to be understood is that the key words are absolutely vital. Okay, putting in these subject-specific terms is really important. So please pause the video here and complete that task. Should only take you about 15 minutes. The last task for this video for year 11 and year 12. What were elections like before reform? Now, you lot wouldn't know what an election is like because you're not old enough to do it yet. But basically, if you go into vote, you have to register. Then you'll be given an election card. You don't have to take that with you. You'll be told where to go on the day of an election. Give your name, give your address, put a cross in a box, and go home. What do the MPs do before an election? They rally, they give speeches, they try and win us over. They have people knocking at our doors going, we should vote for this person. And, you know, it's very different because in 1785, the way in which people tried to get elected was very corrupt. You know, we don't have people bribing us. It's a crime today if MPs tried to bribe us to vote for them. Let's see how it was like before the reform. So due to the variation of the vote, the franchise, it presented a chance for powerful people to take advantage and manipulate the system for their own gain. So because these people were rich, they could manipulate the election. So for example, in 1780, only 2 counties actually had an election, as in the other counties, the leading families in the area chose to divide responsibility between them rather than actually having an election and bribing voters. So the most powerful families in an area said, right, well, you have that part of the county, I'll have this part, you have that part. It means that they didn't have an election because it was decided. One of them were probably going to win, but rather than going through a very expensive election, they decided to split it up, which suggests that democracy was very limited in the counties. If you were rich and influential, you were more likely going to get power through this. So in this respect, elections didn't always happen. In counties, if you were a rich family, you could say, right, we'll split it up, okay? We won't have an election, we'll move from there. When elections did happen, though, it wasn't secret, which meant that on election day, people could see who voted for who, which leads to intimidation. This happened quite easily if the voter had connections to the people in the election. So if you were a voter that had a connection with a landowner or an employer, you sort of had to vote for them to stay on their good side. So there was no fair vote. There was no democracy. There was no voting for who you thought could help you. It was more voting for someone who you had to keep on your good side. Now, pressure was seen in the counties where the landed gentry, the rich people, were able to put pressure on any of their tenants who were able to vote. So if you're a rich person who had lots of people working on your land, you could say to them, vote for me or I'll sack you. Okay? And this was more obvious in the boroughs though. Okay? There were less voters in certain boroughs. The smallest boroughs were known as pocket boroughs. And these were an easy way for rich to ensure they controlled an area, as they basically bribed the area they got the seat. So basically, some people, instead of going to an election, actually brought the area and controlled it. So one example was a place called Gatton in Surrey, which was brought in 1801 at an auction for 90,000, just so the owner didn't need to stand in an election against his nearest rival. So the person that brought it, who had the power in Gatton in Surrey, thought probably cheaper to buy it than to go through an election. He was guaranteed power though, because he brought it. This meant that the system basically was controlled by wealthy property owners, and it meant that politics was controlled by landowners. Only 11% of the population could vote because of the different qualifications. So it was a minimal democracy. The problem with the system led to an opportunity for corruption and allowed the upper class to dominate. If you're rich, you could dominate. The system was totally out of date. Now, what needs to be understood is that the importance of an area was decided in the Middle Ages and didn't reflect how Britain was growing. So places like Manchester didn't actually have any MPs, even though they had the biggest population. But some places, some boroughs, still had MPs, even though they had barely any people. They weren't important. So one example was Old Sarum, which had 14 voters and 32 homes in the whole of their borough, but they still got 2 MPs. Dunwich was another example. Dunwich actually was nearly, most of the borough of Dunwich was nearly in the sea because of coastal erosion, but they still got 2 MPs. These places were known as rotten boroughs. Okay? Areas that weren't important anymore, but still were representative on a parliamentary scale. So by 1831, people had begun to demand change to the system, especially as Britain was going through the Industrial Revolution. You had places like Manchester with a huge population that didn't have any MPs. So you had Manchester with 182,000 people with no MPs, but you had another place that was basically in the sea with nobody living there, still having MPs. It doesn't make sense. That's what elections were like before reform. And what I'd like you to do, first task, create a spider diagram on why the election system was negative. Next to your evidence, explain why that's negative. And then task 2, this is a little bit of an extended writing task. The election system had no chance of succeeding in England in 1785. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Use evidence in this answer. So that's the first sort of overview of this introduction. Now, if we have a look, I'll get rid of that annotation. What have we done in this lesson so far? Where are we at with the scheme of learning? So what we've actually done the unreformed Parliament and its critics. We've looked at the pre-reform electorate, the counties and boroughs, and we've looked at parliamentary seats and elections and the problems with it. That is the first in-depth lesson on this paper. Obviously, we will do, this is enough for now. We will do a lot more detail in class, but if this is just a basic revision for year 12, current year 12, this is a good overview. Current year 11, I want you to work through the tasks, and then you'll be set a deadline for these in the next few coming days.